He's never going to leave me the way things are set up. I made sure of that years ago. And if he finds out, he won't. He's too busy being proud of himself to notice anything. I stood in the hallway outside my own kitchen, keys still in my hand, and listened to my wife laugh at something her mother said next. It was a soft laugh. Familiar. The same laugh I'd fallen for 11 years ago in a coffee shop on Southport Avenue, back when I was still counting quarters for parking meters, and she still thought that was charming instead of embarrassing. $840,000. That was the number I heard next, clear as a bell through the door. $840,000, sitting in an account I didn't know existed, under a name I didn't recognize. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent most of my life believing one simple thing, that a man's worth isn't in what people say about him, it's in what he builds when nobody's watching. My grandmother used to tell me that on her porch in Bronzeville, rocking in a chair that creaked in the same 3 places every single time. I believed her. I built my whole life around it. I didn't say a word. I set my keys down on the entry table, quiet as I could manage, and I listened to the rest. Let me take you back, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. 2 years ago, I sold a logistics company I'd spent 14 years building out of a garage in Pilsen. Sold it for a number that changed the shape of my life overnight, though you wouldn't have known it to look at me. I still drove the same Honda for 8 months after the sale. I still ate lunch at the same diner on 26th Street, where they knew my order before I sat down. Some folks mistake quiet for broken. They're never the same thing. My wife, Renee, was proud of me in the beginning. I remember that clearly, because pride has a particular sound to it, and hers used to be unmistakable. She'd introduce me at parties with her hand resting flat against my chest, like she was showing people something she'd built herself. I liked that. I liked being someone's proof of something. I think, if I'm honest, I built a lot of my life around being that for her. Renee's mother, Carol, never liked me. Not from the first dinner, not ever. Carol had a way of looking at a man like she was pricing him, running numbers behind her eyes, while she smiled with her mouth only. She'd say things like, "Renee could have married a doctor," at Thanksgiving, right in front of everybody, and then act surprised when the room went quiet. I let it go. Every time, I let it go. That was the thing about me people learned quick. I didn't fight in rooms full of witnesses. I fought later, alone, with myself, deciding whether something was worth the cost of saying out loud. Renee used to apologize for her mother in the car afterward, every single time, like clockwork. "That's just how she shows love," she'd say, staring out the passenger window instead of at me. I used to believe that too. I wonder now how much of my marriage was built on things I simply agreed to believe, because believing them was easier than testing them. It was a Tuesday evening when it started. The evening I'm telling you about now, the one with the number and the account and the laugh I recognized. I'd come home early from a meeting on Michigan Avenue. Nothing dramatic, just a canceled call and light traffic on Lakeshore Drive. I let myself in through the side door, the one that doesn't creak, out of habit more than anything. And there was Renee's voice, drifting from the kitchen, pitched low the way people pitch their voices when they think the house is empty. "He's never going to leave me the way things are set up. I made sure of that years ago." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did. I stood in that hallway, and I sat with it for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds. It wasn't the money that did it. It wasn't even the secrecy, not exactly. It was the sentence right before it, the one Carol said that started the whole thing rolling. "You need to think about what happens when the well runs dry, baby. Men like that always find someone younger eventually. Better you're protected before he does." Men like that. I stood there turning that phrase over, wondering what kind of man Carol thought I was, wondering if Renee thought the same thing and had just never said it to my face. 11 years of marriage, and I was still, apparently, a category, a type, a well, waiting to run dry. If you've ever walked into your own home and felt like a stranger in it, stay with me, because it gets worse before anything gets better. Mom, I'm not saying I want out. I'm saying I want to be smart. You raised me to be smart. I raised you to survive, Renee. There's a difference, and you're old enough now to understand it. There was a clink of a mug against the counter, the same sound our coffee mugs always made, the ordinary domestic sound of a Tuesday evening in a kitchen I'd paid for, and it struck me how strange it was that betrayal could happen in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and rosemary, that a woman could plan an exit from a marriage while dinner was still on the stove. I thought about Bronzeville. I thought about my grandmother's porch, the way she'd say a man's worth lives in what he builds when nobody's watching. And I wondered, standing in my own hallway at 41 years old, whether that saying only worked one direction, whether it meant anything if the person watching decided, quietly, years ago, that none of it counted anyway. I didn't walk into that kitchen. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would have been easy to. It would have been satisfying, maybe, for about 4 seconds. Instead, I picked my keys back up off the entry table, and I walked back out the side door, the one that doesn't creak, and I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes, without turning the engine on. 11 minutes. I counted them. I watched the porch light flicker once, the way it always did before it fully warmed up, and I thought about every Thanksgiving I'd sat through Carol's comments with a fork in my hand and a smile on my face, because Renee asked me to let it go, just this once, for her sake. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't arrive loud. It doesn't kick the door down. It sits behind a kitchen wall, laughing softly, calling you the well, and you find out you've been something to be managed for longer than you've been someone's husband. I didn't cry in that car. I want to be clear about that too, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know what people expect. I just sat there, hands on the wheel, engine off, doing the math on 11 years the way you'd do math on a bad investment, quietly, without drama, looking for the exact moment the numbers stopped adding up. Quick question for you before I keep going. If you were standing in that hallway, would you have walked in? Drop a comment and let me know. Team confront or team wait? Because what I did next surprised even me. I didn't confront Renee that night. I went inside 20 minutes later, kissed her on the cheek like nothing had happened, ate the chicken and rosemary she'd made, and told her the meeting on Michigan Avenue had gone fine. She smiled at me across the table the same way she'd smiled at me for 11 years, and I smiled back, and neither one of us said a true thing to the other for the rest of that night. I'm not proud of that, but I needed time, and time is the one thing you can't ask for honestly once somebody knows you're asking. What I didn't know that night, and only understood much later, was that Renee had barely slept either. She told me afterward that she'd lain awake replaying her own voice through that kitchen wall, wondering if I'd heard anything, wondering why I'd been so quiet at dinner, and deciding, the way she'd decided things her whole life, that the safest move was to say nothing and hope the moment passed. She'd gotten good at that particular math over the years. Say nothing, wait it out, let the silence do the work. I understand now that we'd both been doing the same thing to each other for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The next morning, I called a man named David Okafor. David and I went to Kenwood Academy together, back when neither of us had 2 nickels to rub together, and he'd since become the kind of forensic accountant that companies hired when something didn't smell right. I trusted David the way you trust somebody who watched you eat free lunch in a cafeteria and never once brought it up years later when you didn't need free lunch anymore. We met at a diner on 55th Street, the same kind of diner where I still felt most like myself. Vinyl booths and a coffee pot that never seemed to stop moving. David didn't say much when he sat down. He just slid a folder across the table and watched my face while I opened it, the way a doctor watches you while you read test results, already knowing what's inside and bracing for how you'll take it. 840,000, he said. Opened 4 years ago. Feeder account tied to a property sale you co-signed for her mother. Renee's the sole beneficiary. Carol's the sole signer, until Renee turns 45. 4 years. I did the math without wanting to. 4 years ago was the year my company crossed its first 8-figure quarter. 4 years ago was the year Carol started showing up to dinner with a different kind of smile. One I'd mistaken, foolishly, for warmth. "There's more," David said, "and I want you to notice that phrase, because in my experience, there's always more. The property. It's a duplex on Prairie Avenue. Deeds in Carol's name, but the mortgage payments are coming out of a joint account. Your joint account." I sat with that folder open in front of me for a long moment, the coffee pot making its rounds behind me, somebody's kid laughing 2 booths over, ordinary diner sounds going on like nothing had just cracked open on the table between us. I'd been funding my mother-in-law's real estate for 4 years without knowing it. Some folks mistake quiet for broken. I was starting to wonder if quiet had just made me easy. I want to pause the story here and tell you something my grandmother used to say, something I hadn't thought about in years until that morning at the diner. She used to say, every letter came back unopened, every promise came back broken, every door came back locked, and you learn something different from each one, if you're willing to look. I used to think that was about my grandfather, who left when my mother was 6, and never once looked back. Sitting in that diner with David's folder open in front of me, I understood it different. It wasn't really about my grandfather. It was about learning to read a pattern before it finishes writing itself. I didn't go home angry. I went home quiet, which anybody who knows me will tell you is worse. Renee noticed something was different within a week. She asked me twice if everything was okay at work, and both times I told her it was fine. And both times, I watched something flicker behind her eyes that told me she didn't fully believe me. I've thought about that flicker a lot since. I think some part of her already knew the ground had shifted, even if she couldn't have told you why. Carol's 65th birthday was the following Saturday. Renee had been planning it for 2 months. A private room at a restaurant on Rush Street. 40 guests, a 3-tier cake, the whole production. I almost didn't go. I want to tell you that plainly, because there's a version of this story where I stayed home and let the silence do its work in private. But I'd learned something in that 11 minutes in the driveway, something about the difference between waiting and hiding, and I decided I wasn't going to hide. The restaurant had exposed brick and low gold lighting and a jazz trio playing something soft in the corner, the kind of place where trouble doesn't feel like it belongs, which is exactly why it always seems to show up there anyway. Carol held court at the head of the table in a burgundy dress, laughing loud enough that 3 tables could hear her, telling a story about a cruise she'd taken that I was fairly sure my joint account had also paid for. "Marcus." Carol raised her glass toward me around dessert, and something in her voice had an edge to it I recognized from 100 Thanksgivings. "You've gotten quiet lately. Renee tells me you've been distracted. Business troubles?" "No trouble," I said. "Just paying closer attention lately." "Attention." Carol repeated the word like she was tasting it, unimpressed. "That's a nice hobby for a man who used to actually do something with his time. I remember when you couldn't sit still long enough to finish a meal." "Things change," I said. "They certainly do." She smiled around the table, playing to her audience the way she always did. "Renee tells everyone how humble you stayed after selling that company." I always thought humble was just a nicer word for careful. Men don't stay quiet like that, unless they're hiding something or protecting something. "Which is it, Marcus?" A few people at the table laughed, the uncertain kind of laugh people give when they're not sure if they're allowed to. Renee's hand found my knee under the table, a small pressure, a silent request to let it go, the way I always had. "Careful's not a bad word," I said, keeping my voice level, unhurried. I found it keeps a man from confusing what people say about him with what he's actually built. You'd be surprised how much easier it is to see clearly, staying quiet like that. "Is that so?" Carol's smile tightened at the edges, just slightly, a hairline crack nobody else at the table would have caught. "And what exactly have you been seeing, with all this careful attention of yours?" I looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the jazz trio's soft number felt like it was playing just for the 2 of us. "To the well," I said. "Turns out it's deeper than people thought." The table went quiet, the way rooms do when they sense something they can't name yet. Renee's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Carol's smile stayed fixed in place, but her knuckles went pale around the stem of her wine glass, And I noted that the way you note the first crack in a windshield, small, but you know exactly what it means for later. I don't know what you mean, Carol said. I think you do. I kept my voice level. I didn't raise it, not once, not even a little. Prairie Avenue, 4 years of mortgage payments. I think you know exactly what I mean. I watched it land on her face first, then travel to Renee's. That particular horror of being seen clearly in a room full of witnesses. Carol opened her mouth to say something and, for possibly the first time in the 11 years I'd known her, nothing performative came out. This isn't the place, Renee said quietly, her hand finding my arm under the table. You're right, I said. It isn't. I just wanted your mother to know I was paying attention. That's all. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me expected to feel triumphant in that moment, and I didn't. I felt tired. Tired in the specific way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for so long, you'd forgotten it had a weight at all, and somebody's finally asked you to set it down and look at it. If you've ever sat in a room and watched somebody's composure crack for the first time in over a decade, you know it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like the truth, finally taking up the space it was always owed. I left the party 20 minutes later, alone, telling Renee I needed air. I didn't come home that night. I checked into a hotel on Wacker Drive with nothing but the clothes on my back and a folder David had given me, and I lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling, thinking about a chair on a porch in Bronzeville that creaked in the same 3 places every time. Comment below, Team Marcus for calling it out at the party, or Team Wait, he should have handled it privately. I want to know where you land, because what happened the next morning changed everything. I didn't answer Renee's calls that night. 7 of them according to my phone, and 4 text messages that got shorter and more desperate as the hours passed. The last one just said, please, for Maya's sake if nothing else. Maya, our daughter, 9 years old, all elbows and questions, the one person in this entire mess who hadn't asked for any of it. I went home the next morning, not because Renee asked me to, but because a hotel room on Wacker Drive is no place for a man to figure out the rest of his life. I needed my own kitchen. I needed to look at the walls I'd paid for and decide, clearly, what I actually wanted to do about all of it. Renee was at the table when I walked in, still in yesterday's clothes, eyes red in a way that told me she hadn't slept either. Maya was at school, thankfully, which meant we had a window to talk like adults instead of performing for a 9-year-old. I want to explain, Renee said. I know you do. I sat down across from her. Not close, not far. I'm going to let you, but I need you to understand something first. I'm not here because I forgive you. I'm here because I think you owe me the truth, and I think I owe myself the chance to hear it before I decide anything. She nodded slowly. I watched her hands, folded tight on the table, knuckles doing the same pale thing I remembered from her mother's grip on that wine glass. Some things really do run in families. It started small, Renee said. 4 years ago, after your company's numbers changed everything. My mother kept saying I needed protection. Not from you specifically, from the situation. She said money changes men, and I should have something that was mine, separate, just in case. I told myself it wasn't about not trusting you. It was about being smart. Your mother told you to protect yourself from the well running dry, I said. That's not smart, Renee. That's a woman planning your exit for you before you'd even decided you wanted one. She flinched at that, and I let the silence sit there instead of softening it. I'd spent 11 years softening things for other people's comfort. I wasn't in a hurry to do it again that morning. I didn't want out, she said, quieter now. I never wanted out, Marcus. I just let her convince me that wanting security and wanting you weren't the same thing, and somewhere along the way I stopped noticing they'd become 2 separate accounts. Not just money, everything. I kept a version of my life that was just mine, in case yours ever stopped including me. It wasn't malice. It wasn't even really about me, not at the root of it. It was fear wearing my mother-in-law's voice, passed down and repeated so many times that Renee had stopped hearing it as anything other than common sense. Maya came home from school an hour later, backpack half open, missing one shoe for reasons 9-year-olds never fully explain. And she found the two of us still sitting at that same table, quieter than usual, the air still heavy with everything unsaid between us. "Are you guys getting divorced?" she asked, dropping her backpack by the door like she was asking about dinner plans. Neither of us answered right away, and Maya, unbothered by our silence, kept going. "Because Ava's parents got divorced, and now she has 2 rooms and 2 birthdays, and honestly that sounds kind of good. Except she also said her dad cries in the car sometimes, and I don't want you to cry in the car, Dad. I want to tell you, there is nothing on this earth that flattens a grown man's carefully built composure faster than a 9-year-old's plain honesty, delivered without any awareness of the weight it's carrying." I laughed. It came out cracked and unexpected, but it came out real. The first real thing that had happened in that kitchen in 24 hours. "I don't want to cry in the car either, baby," I told her. "So don't," Maya said, like it was the simplest math problem in the world, and went to go find her missing shoe. Kids have a way of cutting straight through the architecture adults spend years building around a simple truth. Maya didn't know about Prairie Avenue, or the $840,000, or 4 years of quiet mortgage payments. She just knew she didn't want her father crying in a car, and somehow that mattered more in that moment than any of it. 2 weeks later, I sat down with Carol. Alone, no restaurant, no jazz trio, no audience, just her dining room on Prairie Avenue, the duplex I'd apparently been funding without knowing it. Morning light, coming through curtains that I now understood I'd probably paid for as well. "I don't see why we're doing this here," Carol said, arms crossed, chin lifted, the performance flickering back on the moment she saw me on her doorstep. "You made your point at the restaurant. Wasn't that enough for you?" "No," I said, taking a seat without being asked. "That was for an audience. This is for the truth. I don't owe you a conversation, Marcus. I owe my daughter my loyalty. That's all I've ever given her. You owe me an explanation for 4 years of my money going into a house I didn't know I was paying for," I said, keeping my voice level, unhurried, the same way it had stayed level at that restaurant table. "You can call that loyalty if it helps you sleep. I call it something else." Carol held her chin up a moment longer, but I watched something behind her eyes finally give out, the way a held breath finally releases when there's nothing left to hold it up with. "I did what I thought was right," she said, and there was none of the performance left in her voice, none of the Thanksgiving edge. Just a tired woman, 65 years old, finally cornered by her own choices. "I watched my own husband leave with nothing but the shirt on his back to show for 20 years, Marcus. I swore my daughter would never be that unprotected. I didn't think about what it would cost you. I didn't let myself think about it, if I'm honest." "That's more than I deserve, hearing you say it plain like that," I told her. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not here for an apology that explains it away. I'm here because Renee is my wife, and Maya is my daughter, and you don't get to keep deciding, quietly, what kind of man I am. Not anymore. So where does that leave us?" "We start from here," I said. "Not from Thanksgiving, not from the well, not from anything you've said about me for 11 years. Just from here, and we see what gets built on it." I didn't forgive Carol completely that morning, and I want to be honest about that, because I think total, instant forgiveness makes for a nice ending, but a dishonest one. I forgave her enough to let her stay in Maya's life, enough to let her back to a Thanksgiving table eventually. The rest, I decided, would have to be earned back slowly. The same way everything worth having gets built. Quietly, brick by brick, when nobody's watching to give you credit for it. Renee and I are still married. I won't pretend the last few months have been easy, because they haven't. We closed the Prairie Avenue account together, sat across from a lawyer, and restructured everything so that trust wasn't just a word we said to each other, but something written down, plain, in language even Carol couldn't misread. Some nights we still sit at that same kitchen table and just talk, the ordinary kind of talk, about Maya's homework or a leaking faucet or nothing at all. And I've come to understand that this, the leaking faucet, the ordinary Tuesday, is the actual prize, not the confrontation at the restaurant. Not being right. Just this. My grandmother used to say, "A man's worth isn't in what people say about him, it's in what he builds when nobody's watching." I used to think that saying was about career, about money, about the garage in Pilsen and everything that came after it. I understand it different now. It was never about the business. It was about a kitchen table, a 9-year-old's missing shoe, and choosing, quietly, every single day, to keep building something real, instead of just defending something that looked real from the outside. If this story hit home for you, if you've ever had to rebuild trust with someone quietly instead of loudly, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment landed hardest for you. The restaurant, the kitchen table, or Maya and the missing shoe. Hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to catch the next story. Because next time, I'm telling you about the letter that showed up 4 years too late, and what it cost me to finally open it. This story was written with the help of AI for language and structure, creative direction, editing, and story development by Afro Soul Writers Room.